Welcome back to Faith in Focus. I'm your host, Nick Sales. Today we have a very special guest. This is my good friend, Casey McFarland. He's an amazing photographer. We've done a lot of shoots together. We went to Ireland a couple months ago and had some great conversations there. Casey has had some pretty brutal experiences in his life. He went through a gnarly faith crisis with the LDS Church a few years ago, and he has told me his whole story. And despite that faith crisis, Casey is still one of the most Christ-like men that I have ever met in my life. And so we want to get to know Casey a little bit. We want to hear your story. We want to hear your perspective on things. We want to hear about your mission. So tell us a little bit about the mission that you have and what you're trying to do with members and those who have left the church.
Well, first of all, Nick and I we got stuck on a train for like 4 or 5 hours in Ireland. We had a just amazing discussion. Nick's a great guy. So I'm really happy to be here. I have definitely had a lot of struggle and a lot of, my wife, for all intents and purposes, has left the church. I still pop in every once in a while, but we certainly had a time period where I was like planning an exit strategy for my whole family to leave the church. And so I have I don't really have a label for really who I am, to be quite honest. I'm just kind of doing things on my own terms. And so, because I live in the middle of a very, very Orthodox community of Latter-day Saints, and I've ebbed and flowed and had a lot of different feelings around that. So we'll talk more about that, but I think it's really important to give a little context there. My idea here is that there's this concept within the LDS community that I've kind of repurposed a little bit. And it's, this line that says that we'll turn the hearts of the children to the fathers and the hearts of the fathers to the children. And what I see happening within the Latter-day Saint community is a lot of really good people on both sides, just like with a division right down the middle. Like
Both sides, meaning members of the church and those who have left the church.
People who stay, people who leave, ex-Mormons, whatever. So there's this kind of like divide that's happened because people are leaving and people don't know how to respond to it within families. So literally you can go to a Thanksgiving dinner and have the family split down the middle on this issue. And it becomes a point of divide when I hope that we can bring about some change to kind of bring people back together. And that's why I kind of like that idea of repurposing that in a way to turn our hearts back towards each other a little bit and find some commonality. But there's something that happened to me because I kind of had a really pretty big major faith crisis while I was the Elders Quorum president in my ward. And I had been struggling for a decade before that, but I got to be really good friends with the people in my ward community. And I also got to be really good friends with a lot of people who had left the church or were leaving the church. And there was this divide I noticed in my neighborhood. We literally had like 5 people on my street who were leaving the church. And I noticed, and I was really good friends with them. I was really good friends with all the people in the ward council. Well, one day, one of the bishopric members came over to my house and he said, I just had this amazing spiritual moment like at my neighbor's house, who I was really good friends with, who a guy hadn't been to church in 20 years, and his wife was inactive. She was, for all intents and purposes, leaving the church. And I said, well, that's awesome. Tell me about it. And he says, well, I just bore my testimony and all this stuff. I'm like, great. 2 weeks later, that same neighbor that he had been over to their home came over and he's like, listen, I just had the most awkward, like really difficult like thing happen. Like this guy came to our home and it was the most awkward thing I've ever experienced. Like, and I'm going, I'm hearing 2 stories here. I'm hearing like this big, like there is a communication gap happening here that's really wide. And so I see 2 languages, people trying to speak 2 different languages at each other. And it's like somebody speaking Japanese to somebody who doesn't understand Japanese at all, and vice versa. And then they start to get angry at each other because they don't understand each other at all. So I think we have a lot of communication problems within the Latter-day Saint community. And the irony of the thing is, I think a lot of people who leave the church actually still retain a lot of the same character and some of the same beliefs. And so we're not too far different a lot of times. And I'd like to see us more focus on some of those commonalities. And this is happening within relationships. I've had a number of spouses get divorced over some of these issues, right? Friends of mine. My wife and I, for a little while, had to go to counseling because we're trying to figure out when the earth kind of comes out from underneath us, and we don't know really what to do. And that we actually had to have a third party, like a therapist, like help us to communicate in a way that we didn't know how to communicate to each other.
And this was through your faith crisis.
Yeah. And so it was like, where are we going? We had this foundation that it was a common ground, and now that's gone. Now what do we do here? And that's happening within families on a regular basis today. So my goal is not to say, hey, I want people to come into the church or out of the church. That's not I really just would love to see some movement in a where we can start kind of validating one another. And validation, I think, is probably one of the biggest spiritual superpowers of our day. I think it's why, like, Joe Rogan has such a huge podcast, because he can sit and listen to people whether he agrees with them or not. It's kind of funny that we have this like comedian, pot smoking guy has this massive following, and it's just because he can sit there and listen to different opinions without getting triggered,
without making fun of them, without saying that they're crazy.
Tell me more. Well, that's interesting. Well, here's a question, and even push back and not have like a big argument. And I think so we need to move, both sides I think need to move into a place where we can communicate and validate and understand each other a little bit better. And that's a tall order.
It is. I have this kind of ongoing theory where I think that, especially this is true with politics, but I think it can also be true with religion. In politics, you have the far right, who is crazy, psycho, conspiracy theories. And then you have, just the regular conservatives over here who are normal and decent people who have good morals and good standards. And then over here, you have the good, decent Democrats who have also good standards and good ideals, and then you have the far left over here. Now, the people on the edges are psycho and crazy, and those are the ones that kind of attack and go at each other. Whereas most of the people here in the middle, even though they either identify as Republican or Democrat, they're still they agree on 80 to 90% of the things. They still consider themselves good people. They're not completely psycho. They don't do a lot of name calling, but they just have they don't necessarily agree on everything, but they respect the opinions of others. What's interesting about this is that those on the both far sides, it's almost like a horseshoe, where if you look at it that way, on both ends, the ends of the horseshoe are closer together than the other part of the horseshoe. And I think that that's something that I've noticed a lot with the church is you have on one side, you have what I call the anti-Mormons, who are very hardcore, very wanting to just critique, attack, demoralize, criticize, a lot of negativity. And then you have, I would say, the ex-Mormon community, people who have left the church, but are still great people, have great morals, great standards, are very kind, respectful. Then you have the members of the church who are kind, respectful, and don't agree with everyone's opinions, but are very respectful of their opinions if they may be different or their beliefs. And then you have on the far side, you have the members of the church who are super self-righteous. They never believe that any of the prophets have ever made mistakes. They think that everything in church history has been absolutely perfect. God has inspired every single aspect of church history. And what's interesting is I would say on both ends of the spectrum, they are very similar in the way that they attack others, the way that their egos are inflated, the way where it just turns into unhealthy arguments where it's almost like they're just flinging mud at each other instead of sitting down and having a conversation where they can say, okay, let me really truly try to understand where you're coming from and speak to you respectfully without any personal attacks, without exaggerating my point or inflating what I'm trying to say. And so if I understand you correctly, your goal is to try to kind of bridge the gap between those who have left the church and members who are still in the church, trying to help them to be kind and respectful, empathetic, and understanding of each other.
It's a very naive attempt, but it's an attempt. Like, that's it. Like, if I had it in my world, I would put Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on a desert island and say, you have a match and you have some fuel. Now you guys got to figure out how to live with one another. Like, at its grassroots, I love what Marjorie Pay Hinckley said. She says, you would love everybody if you got to know their story. It was such a beautiful. I love that woman. If you sat down and listened to somebody's story, you would love them. And she was without exception, right? But how do you get past that barrier, like that intensity, right? That's the big question we're trying to ask today. Is I think that's kind of the spiritual work, and I look at this kind of like. Right after 9/11 happened, there was like a 2-week period where Democrats and Republicans were like frolicking in fields together and like holding hands and like, we have a common enemy,
Yep.
And the common enemy was Al Qaeda or Bin Laden or whatever. And for this brief moment, we had this like, hey, we love each other, and it was interesting. And then all of a sudden, it's like somebody flipped a switch and goes, no, we're done. That's over. And the irony, what I see is the true enemy that's happening between us is pride, and it's really kind of at the heart of. I think if pride can be the enemy inside of a home, then there can be commonality. So my wife and I, for all intents and purposes, are a mixed faith family, but we have a common goal, and our common goal is like we're trying to rid ourselves of ego. We're trying to learn how to grab a hold of the tree of life and taste of the pure love of God, so to speak. So if we have that common goal, then we can look past a few differences. Can I share like this thing? There was a talk actually that Uchtdorf gave,
Of course.
that I thought was really good, because I think what happens sometimes. Anyway, I'm just going to read this and we can talk about it. This is to me how I view like the Book of Mormon, for example. It's just a conflict between just people, right? In the Book of Mormon, both the Nephites as well as the Lamanites created their own truths about each other. The Nephites' truth, he's got a parenthesis around that, about the Lamanites was that they were a wild and ferocious and a bloodthirsty people, never able to accept the gospel. The Lamanites' truth about the Nephites was that Nephi had stolen his brother's birthright, and that Nephi's descendants were liars who continued to rob the Lamanites of what was rightfully theirs. These truths fed their hatred for one another until it finally consumed them all. Needless to say, there are many examples in the Book of Mormon that contradict both of these stereotypes. Nevertheless, the Nephites and Lamanites believed these truths that shaped the destiny of this once mighty and beautiful people. That's in, I think it's called What is Truth, talk that Uchtdorf gave. And I could it be any more clear? Like, that's what's happening right now. And if the Book of Mormon like is a book for our day, like we claim it is, then it's an interesting parallel to see how these two families split, and they just ebb and flow outside of this anger and fighting and infighting and all this stuff. And the only common thread between the both of them is when, in fact, the pinnacle is when of the Book of Mormon, where they finally kind of achieve something, is when there's no more ites among them, and where they have like this moment of like, hey, we tapped into a thread, and the thread was divinity. The thread was like, hey, we're having a change of heart here. And that can happen whether you're in the church or without the church, right? You can have this moment where you go, I'm done fighting. I want to rid myself of pride.
Yeah.
I don't want to have hate in my heart anymore. And that is a higher spiritual work that I think both sides of us need to work on. And that's the whole goal why we're here in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
I completely agree. You told me something once that pierced my heart, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. You once said, when you build bridges, you get walked on by both sides. Can you tell me a little bit about what your experience has been with that?
Yeah. You can see it in politics. It's always a good example. Somebody tries to do something against Donald Trump or against whoever it is, like they get eaten alive by their party. It's human nature. It's just a human tendency. And I think it's really important to understand that if you're going to try to be a bridge, you need to be prepared to have mud flinged at you from both sides, period. So I had a moment where that same on my street, I went to, because I was good friends with both sides, I went to the leaders in my church, and I'm like, hey, what if we could sit down and listen to what people are going through? Because after I'd heard this the story of the bishopric guy saying he had this amazing experience at home, I'm going, I don't think we actually know. I don't think either side knows what's even going on, because nobody's talking with each other normally, right? They're not getting down and saying, what is it really that people are struggling with? Why are people really leaving the church? And of course, there's a myriad of reasons, and I know it's scary, but if you don't understand a problem, you can't solve it. And so I was going, what if we were to, I asked somebody in our leadership community, what if I were able to get these people together and we could listen to them and have this moment? And I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be really well received, right? It wasn't at first. Now, so this is the thing. You have to expect there's going to be pushback no matter what, and it's understandable, right? But at first it was like, now what are we doing again? Because I was like, they kind of agreed to do this, and they would bring like the leadership from the stake presidency, the bishopric, ward councils, all this stuff, to listen to these people what they really want from the church, what they really want to have happen when people come over and knock on their door and do ministering or whatever. One day I was coming out of a sacrament meeting, and I got called into an upper leader's office and the stake presidency, bishopric, and I just got kind of reamed. At first, it was like, and I understand their fear, but I genuinely was trying to do something good. And it was like somebody took a baseball bat to my knees. And I'm going to put it lightly, but I got yelled at. To their credit, they calmed down. Stake presidency says, you know what? Guy in the stake presidency says, I think you're just trying to help. But I'm like,
finally someone understands.
This is what I'd been wanting to hear while I was in the Elders Quorum president for years. Like, I know I'm a little outside of the box. I know I do things a little quirky, but I have good intentions, right? And you have to take into consideration somebody's intentions. So they ended up going through with it. They had a panel, and we sat down for 2 hours with, I think, close to 25 members of the stake presidency, the bishopric, ward councils, young women, Relief Society presidencies from the stake, came and sat and listened for 2 hours to, and my wife was on that panel, by the way, to just people just say, here's what we're going through. And so, yes, a little bit rough at first, but it turned out. And the thing is, you have to expect it's going to be messy. I kind of have this tagline of pioneering paradox, because we're pioneering a crapload of new stuff that we've never done before. We've never had to have these conversations.
Yep.
So we're just kind of moving into territory that's like, this could get ugly. In fact, I have a really good relationship with my old bishop. That's another story. My wife and I got called in out of the blue as part of this whole thing. Like, this was actually a part of that I'm going to talk about later, but and we got our temple regulations taken away. It completely shocked us. We were, from my perspective, there was no worthy initiative. There's nothing. Like, it was just fear. And it was like, there's some other, I won't get into it, but I'll just say that I think because we've been willing, me and that same bishop have been willing to have this conversation over the last 5 years since then. We went out to lunch 2 months ago, and he just said, listen, I am far less judgmental than I was because of our conversations, because we've kept the dialogue open, and it's been ugly. And he's told me, I've hated you sometimes, and I'm like, I've hated you sometimes too, and I wanted to strangle you, and I wanted to strangle you too, and we hugged out in the parking lot.
Wow.
And it was a moment, and it was a moment of release for me too, because if I'm holding that grudge or that anger, which I was for a little while, it broke my heart to have my temple recommend taken away. And holding on to that, it's like I end up owning the problem. It's me that's the one has now got. It's now on me that I've got to release some, and I've got to forgive, and I've got to give grace, because honestly, there's like 30,000 bishops, and these guys are just trying to do the best they can, and accidents are going to happen, and miracles are. I think miracles are happening behind closed doors at the same time. Yeah. I've often lamented that there's this there's bishops they get bashed, and there's like this I hate to put it this way, but there's kind of like the piss and post of and they have to listen to like 300 people come into their office and complain all the time.
Yeah.
And they have to hold on to this secrets, and they have to hold this space. And I know there's a lot of good things going on inside of those doors, but they can't say anything about it. And I think that's a hard thing. And so what I'm hoping for is a little bit of intellectual honesty on both sides, and say, have bishops cause pain? Yes.
Absolutely.
Are they also preventing pain? Yes. And I can say that from my own perspective, from my own experiences. And that's the paradox. And that's why I think we're moving into this kind of thing where you've got to be able to hold it. There's paradox in all of this, right? And so anyway.
So that sounds like a pretty traumatic experience to go through, getting yelled at by the stake presidency, arguing with your bishop, him not understanding your intentions. Tell me, so that's, would be getting walked on from one side. What about the other side? You've told me before that you have some pretty close friends who have left the church and are pretty hardcore on the anti side.
Yeah.
What has your experience been like with them, where they have maybe given you some pushback or some hard times with things that you said to them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I heard with this lady, she was talking about her son. She said, my son is so open-minded, he hates judgmental people. I want you just let that simmer in just for a second here, okay? In other, what she's saying, my son is he's so open-minded, and yet he's so judgmental. Like, he hates judgmental people. Like, I guess this is what I see happening. I see a lot of people kind of moving into another camp, leaving the church, and they're saying, I just feel so much like I'm so open-minded now. And I'm so open to new ideas, and that is true. There is like this like exploring new ideas and seeing new things.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Right?
Yeah.
But what I think is really happening is people, their open-mindedness oftentimes is just moving to another group of people who agrees with everything you're saying. When I get into these conversations a lot of times, and I hear this kind of like, I'm so much less judgmental, so I'm like, cool. And I have a litmus test. I'm like, I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I'm just like being honest, like testing the waters. If I can actually be safe around them with some of the things that I still like about the church. Because there's a lot of things I still like about the church. And so, there's this aspect about Joseph Smith that I really like. I'm like, whoa. I thought we were open-minded, right? What you're saying to me is you're open-minded to everything but this. Like, this is going to trigger you to the nth degree. And we'll get around to this, but I think this is where a lot of the work has to happen. And I have been guilty of this too. I've been guilty of like getting triggered and getting thinking I'm all open-minded and I'm enlightened and all this stuff. And then I'm going, dude, I'm just as judgmental. I'm more judgmental of the very people that kind of birthed me into existence, right? And there's something to be said about taking time to grieve and be angry and have that experience of just, you can't, like, anger is a real emotion that you have to process through. But we have to be honest with one another, like, and say, am I really being open-minded? Am I being open-minded to my parents or the people who have decided to stay in the church? Am I open to their ideas as well when I go to Thanksgiving dinner, right? Because we're sitting here going, we need you to accept where we are, that we've left the church. We need you to accept that. But we're not accepting. We're just waiting for them to leave the church. They have to leave the church, And I'm not saying that happens all the time, but that is a very common thing that I see. Yeah. And so I have been, when I actually feel unsafe in both categories sometimes. I'm like, I don't definitely know what to say anywhere anymore. Like, because I'm going, on one hand, I want to be able to say, dude, I really actually love this Buddhist thing or whatever, with my Mormon friends. And then on the other hand, I want to say, hey, you guys, did you know that Joseph Smith won an award posthumously for urban planning? Like I mean, liberals should be just floating in the sky over this. Like, for the plot map of Zion, the Urban Planning Association of America like gave him an award. Said this is a crazy, amazing plot map for planning for all the integration of society and the arts and farming and agriculture and all this stuff. People should be eating this stuff up, right? But they're, so anyway.
It's easier to focus on the negative.
Well, it's an addiction. I've read 3 biographies on Brigham Young, and he is such a colorful. I've had the same kind of experience. I'm just kind of going, I honestly, I don't think I'd be here without Brigham Young. I mean, I know that's stupid. For people that they're going to have a knee-jerk reaction to this, but I'm like going, yeah, Brigham Young. This is the paradox. Brigham Young said some flippin' crazy things. I lead people on group tours to Italy, and they're like, I think I have 14 people. Brigham Young led 70,000 people across the plains. That's a freaking hard thing to do. And was there some tyranny there? Yeah. Try leading 70,000 people, right? But there's this like really strange, there's so many fascinating aspects of Brigham Young. He ends up like owning like 11 homes because he needed them, because he had a lot of wives. But he gave up 5 homes just because he believed in something. And I just got interviewed on a podcast that was talking about learning to be yourself. It was somebody who had left the church, right? And they're like, what's one of your biggest examples for learning how to just be yourself? And I said, Brigham Young. And they're like,
what?
I mean, and to be honest with you, I'm there, why Brigham Young? I'm like, because there's this big movement of learning to like step in your own shoes, be a man, whatever. There's like kind of this thing going on right now. I'm going, dude, Brigham Young didn't give a flying crap what anybody thought. And I admire that. And I admire that somebody who's just like, dude, I don't care. Like his eulogy that Jedediah Grant gave was just bananas. Like, I wish I had it here to read to you, but it was just like, we don't care what you think back east. Like everybody thought they were nuts and all this stuff. And he's like, we don't care. This is our thing and we're doing it. And I think anyway, I could go on a tangent there, but
I just remember one time you said, I was talking with a lot of my hardcore anti-Mormon friends and they were bashing Brigham Young, and I started telling them all of the amazing things that Brigham Young did. And they were just kind of like, what?
Yeah, I'm going to do that all the time, but it's because I really think he did. And it really is, it's kind of like, it was actually, I was telling somebody that I actually think that there's a lot of stuff about Joseph Smith right now that I think millennials and Gen Z would go bonkers over. Mm-hmm. Like, I look at Joseph Smith and I go, yes, I know. I can go 9 miles deep. I know every negative thing that any prophet's ever said or did. So let's just get that out of the way, okay? Joseph Smith created a place for misfits. Zion was nothing other than a place where people were not accepted in their own homes because they were part of a Calvinistic society. And they were like, it was hellfire damnation all across America, and especially in the East. So you have this thing going on where they're going, dude, we're going to hell at home. Brigham Young, when he was 11 years old, was walking past somebody's home and they were playing violin music. And he stopped and he listened and he knew he was going to hell because violin music was forbidden as part of that community. Wow. That was the Calvinist, the Puritanism, all that sort of thing, right? By the way, I think a lot of the cancel culture today is just like a new form of Puritanism. It's a mirror of that religion, right? Of you can't make a mistake. You can't do anything wrong. That's another subject. But Brigham Young said, I feel like shouting hallelujah for just the very idea that I knew the prophet Joseph Smith, right? Because he'd never danced. He'd never done anything. And so if you look at Brigham Young from the perspective of a little kid, he's a human. And there's something there that I think is part of, I have a hard time with people getting canceled across the board who can't defend themselves, right? And who can't stand up and say, because the truth is, Brigham Young learned to dance. He learned to be in theater. because of Joseph Smith. Because Joseph Smith was saying, look, there's a bigger way of looking at Christianity here. And people who leave the church can say, well, I hate it, I hate all that stuff. That's okay. But maybe a way of reframing Joseph Smith, if you've left the church, is just to say, well, it was a step in the right direction. And maybe carry the baton to something better. And that's okay, right? But it's a step in the right direction. So I have these conversations a lot with people because for the most part, and I could say the same thing. By the way, I'm going to say this on the flip side here. I talk with a lot of members who try to whitewash and do the same thing on the other side, right? And like I just had a conversation with somebody and they were trying to make like Joseph Smith, put him on a pedestal. And I'm like, dude, no, like you're trying to make stuff up that didn't happen. Like there's genuine reasons for people to have some struggle with this, right? And so that doesn't help either. You know what I mean? And so anyway.
Yeah, I love that. Let's kind of change gears a little bit.
Okay.
You are a big advocate for teaching our kids and teaching youth in the church about mistakes in church history, mistakes that prophets have made, things that have happened, the dark side of church history.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's so important? Well, I guess first of all, why do you think a lot of people in the older generations haven't been taught these things at church? And why do you think it's important to start teaching our kids and the youth and the rising generation about the dark parts of church history?
I think it's a really important question. And it's both. On one hand, America as let's generationally. All of my grandfathers, there was one of my grandpas died young. I had 3 grandpas, and all of them served in World War II or the Korean War. That generation, their biggest primary virtue that they were taught was loyalty. Okay, and so to speak out against the United States of America in World War II was treason. I mean, you could get in a lot of trouble, right? We're in war. So that generation has a really deep sense of loyalty. Such a great virtue, right? And by the way, my parents' generation, the boomer generation, they also have that sense of loyalty. Loyalty is their primary virtue, right? The younger generation now, our generation grew up in the information age. And, I caught the tail end of this whole thing. The primary virtue is authenticity. It's like transparency. Because we've watched a lot of stupid things happen in government, and we have a lot of cynicism for good reasons, right? So talking about this, when I was growing up, talking about anything like this was like a sign of lack of loyalty. It was like going against the primary virtue. And I could even take this further back to Joseph Smith's time and let's go back. This is Richard Bushman, who wrote Rough Stone Rolling. He's talking about like loyalty became paramount because half of Joseph Smith's apostles abandoned him and tried to kill him and did kill him. So loyalty became a huge thing generationally in our church, right? The new generations are going, loyalty is not our primary virtue. So what we have happening here, the way I see it, is not like you're bad, you're good. I see a head-to-head competition of virtue. And I think they're being mislabeled. I think the younger generation just shakes their heads like my grandparents and my parents are nuts. Like they just, they stick to a party line and they just vote this way and they don't ever deviate, right? There's some downsides to loyalty, right? But there's some downsides to the other virtue too. So authenticity, that's why I think there hasn't been a lot of talk about it up until now. And so I'm going to kind of shift this in a little bit. I had a photo shoot with Stephen R. Snow. I think it's important for members to understand that the church has actually within the CES program had a program they call inoculation. And it's like, look, let's talk about some things. I don't think they do a very good job of it. And let's get some stuff out in the air so it's not this big surprise. Like this happened maybe 10 years ago or something. And I bring up Stephen R. Snow because he was the one he announced it. We have moved into this kind of, it's a mix of authenticity, but it's also a mix of Puritan culture. We literally have come full circle to a puritanical way of thinking that nobody can make a mistake. And if they do, it blows up our world. And I can relate to that. There's some reasons for that. But I went and did a photo shoot. I got a commission to do a photo shoot with Stephen R. Snow, who's the head of the church history department. Mm-hmm. He was very, very gracious to me. In fact, I after the photo shoot, I'm like, it was for a cover of a magazine or something. I'm like, he had like 2 weeks left as the historian. In fact, he's the one who rolled out Saints and all that, right? And he says, look, I said, can I talk to you? I said, I'm like on the verge of leaving the church. Like this is, I'm struggling, you know? And he's like, you know, I get it. You know, he was very, very validating to me. But he said something to me, he says like, you know, because he's like, there is a big difference between somebody who learns difficult things when they're 12 years old and when they're 28 years old. And so we had a discussion and the reason why we were having this discussion was because I was getting opposite advice from my bishop and people who were saying, give the milk before the meat, don't give the meat. I'm trying to say, look, kids are getting the meat on TikTok every day. Mm-hmm. Like there's no milk before meat anymore. Like this is like, that's gone. That's history. My kids are eating T-bones, right? Anyway, whatever. And that was really, I think it was good to hear because he was saying, look, we're trying to roll things out in a way that's I mean, look, you got to have a little bit of honesty and empathy too. You can't talk about these things in general conference. You got first graders and third graders and all of these different people all over the place. So it's not an easy thing to talk about. But there are things and aspects that are hard in our church history. And it is really painful to find those things out. And it was the beginning of my faith crisis, was like finding something out when I'm 30 going, what does that mean about blah, 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 right? And can I trust, you know? Mm-hmm. So it was a lot. So what the cost of not talking about these things is we lose trust. Mm-hmm. And with a group of people whose number one virtue is authenticity and like believing in somebody, you know, I would say right now it's a better card to play. I'm just saying, here it is. Look, we're going to give you, here's the information. Like we're given informed consent here. And that's hard to do for people who are still in loyalty mentality, right? And I think some of that loyalty would be good to rub off on people too, yeah. Right? But I think the authenticity would be good to rub off on the older generation too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so for somebody, I think it's really important. Like you and I grew up going to like the Beehive House, like, and you go on a little field trip or something to the Beehive House in Salt Lake City, and they're like, yeah, Brigham Young had 55 wives or whatever. Oh, cool. When you're 12, when you're 28. This is according to Steve R. Snow, and I believe the same thing. And you've like built a foundation on something, and you find out like there's this big piece that's hard to swallow. That's difficult. In fact, I would say in today's world, Christ's parable about the wise man building his house on the rock and the foolish man building his house on sand. My definition of sand is anything that can that's omitted, that can like have your foundation come out from underneath you later on, is a foundation built on sand. Yeah. So with my kids, and by the way, in the middle of all this where I'm thinking about leaving the church on this stuff, our daughter comes to us and she's like, I've got my mission papers in. My wife is checked out of the church at this point, and we're just going, whoa, we didn't even know. Like, so she's doing all this on her own. And she's going, I love this. I'm going, okay. To me, it was just my responsibility to say, we're going to sit down and we're going to go through a crap load of stuff. I don't want you having any surprises on your mission. Like, I don't think that's responsible or ethical. And so I think that's a really important thing. And sadly, and however you want to look at it, I think it's kind of fallen onto the shoulders of parents. And I think it's really because it's hard to talk about in church. It's hard to talk about in elders' quorum. It's hard to talk about anywhere. And when my daughter comes home and she's 14 and she's like, Dad, did you know Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old? Like, this is an actual conversation. My response was, "That ain't nothing." You know what else he did? Da 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 da. But I'm going to be honest with you. He also did a lot of really, really, really cool things, because that's the honest thing to say. And what I see happening is these two camps. One just like, there's Joseph Smith never did anything wrong, and they have to prove all these things. And then the other camp's going, Joseph Smith's the worst. He's a cult leader. He's a blah 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 blah. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And like, my point is, this is happening with every leader we have on the planet right now. Anybody who's done our founding fathers, everybody who has been a hero or done something for the community or anything in any way, shape, or form is at risk of being flushed down the toilet right now, because we're unwilling to talk about both sides. One camp is like, wants to talk about Thomas Jefferson was the worst slaveholder on the planet, Another one's going, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm going, he did both. He did both, and that's the truth.
Yeah,
we have to teach both, and that's a tall order. But I would rather have my kids trust me and trust the institutions and their community, even if that means they're going to choose a different path. To me, that means it's more important for me, because trust, where can kids trust anymore? Like, so I see, from my perspective, I would love to see, like, we just own some things and own it and just, we made a mistake. We blew it. And even apologize, maybe. That'd be nice. I just listened to a podcast with Richard Iyer, who was the head of the, or not the head, but he was on Oprah. He's a Latter-day Saint guy, a Harvard guy who was a parenting guru. And he's like, listen, we have got to figure out a way of keeping young families from imploding while they're in their 20s, while they're trying to raise kids. Like, it's hard when you're going through a faith crisis, right? I just think I think we'd actually prevent a lot if we had these conversations early on. That's all.
I agree. There's a quote that says, it's easier to build strong children than repair broken men. And I think that's true. What would you say, coming from the perspective of faith, what would you say are some of the benefits that could come from teaching these things to our kids?
Teaching some of the hard things.
Yeah.
The first one is, this is debatable, but I just listened to someone say, because I'm very involved in all, I get my thumb on all the stuff going on in our community. And I listened to a podcast, and I think it's Terrell Givens, who he said, the number one reason kids are coming home from their mission is because of scrupulosity, which is a form of OCD that obsesses over whether somebody's worthy or not. Well, when you have a hero and you put somebody on a pedestal and they look perfect,
appear to be flawless,
that's unattainable.
Yeah.
When Richard Bushman wrote his book, Rough Stone Rolling, Joseph Smith was saying, I'm a rough stone rolling. I'm like, I got chisel, I got like parts of me that are really rough, right? It humanizes it, and it gives, like, they blew it a lot, and it kind of gives you a little bit of like, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. If they made a ton of mistakes and did so many things in their life or whatever, and then maybe I could make a mistake and it's going to be okay. I think that's one thing right there.
Yeah, saying if they are just as messed up as I am, and they still ended up doing amazing things, maybe there is some hope for me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to say it. Like, people who are listening, who are anti or whatever, or they can be mad at me or whatever, but I'm like, Joseph Smith was 38 when he died. When he founded Nauvoo, it was a swamp. He had a lot of flaws. He did stupid things, In fact, one time him and Porter Rockwell built a bar in the Nauvoo mansion while Emma was out of town, right? She got home and she had them tear it right back out. They were like little kids a little bit, But Nauvoo, within 3 years, was the largest city in Illinois. It was bigger than Chicago.
Wow.
Can we at least acknowledge that? They turned a swamp into something. I still think Nauvoo is absolutely beautiful. I mean, they call Nauvoo the Beautiful or something. I don't know, but it's like that's that's unfathomable. Like, and these were people who were just going, I found my tribe. And they were, a lot of them were extremely intelligent, educated, and a lot of them were backwards hillbillies who were having to go and learn how to speak just basic English, you know? Anyway, I think it's astounding. So if somebody who can do all these flaws, there's a way of reframing and say, yeah, okay, I get it. Like Joseph Smith did stuff, and at the same time, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's an honest approach.
Do you think that prophets and leaders of the church who have made terrible mistakes, do you think that they need forgiveness from Jesus Christ as much as anyone else?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith's getting chastised constantly.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole church is like 6 months after in the Doctrine and Covenants, 6 months after is the scripture says you're the one true and living church, right? They're all under condemnation. The whole church is under condemnation for just sinning or whatever, you know. That's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Because I think the call of today, like the call of any kind of spirituality, is self-reflection and going, maybe the story of the Nephites and the Lamanites is not about the other people. Maybe it's about me. And this is the story. You can say this about the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism or the Quran or whatever. All these, they're about self-reflection and not passing the blame onto somebody else and saying, no, maybe it's me that needs to take some inner lookings. You know? Recently, somebody said to me, I hadn't been to church in a long time, and I have a lot of friends there, and I just popped in, and I went to Elder's Quorum, and the teacher said, "What do you think Jesus would say to the youth right now, if he were to come here?" And I said, I raised my hand, and I have a policy, by the way, if I feel like somebody's saying something that makes my heart raise, I have a heart monitor on my phone. I said, I don't think Jesus would have said anything. I think he would have listened to the youth. And he said, well, I don't know. Jesus would have already known their thoughts. Next, you know, and I'm like, no, that's not the point. The point is, if a kid has the opportunity to say, Dad, Mom, I've read something online that really kind of bothers me because it seems contrary to what I've been taught even, right? Can I talk to you about it? Like, that's a real benefit for a kid to be able to feel safe, to be able to say something to his parents. That, I think, is the greatest spiritual work we have in the church, is that leaders and parents have to get to a place where they're willing to listen to hard things from their kids. And the kids can go, you know what? I know that if I go to my parents, they're going to give me an honest answer. And if they don't know the answer, that's okay. But they're not going to shame me for having the question, right?
Yeah.
That, I think, is a huge piece of the puzzle that we need to do right now, and just get a spiritual work within our community, and leaders and everybody just has to do the spiritual work inwardly and say, I need to prepare myself to listen to kids, because we have kids who are struggling right now. And social media, just in general, but the one place that they want to talk about these things is the one place they don't feel safe to talk about them. They talk about these things everywhere else, I promise you.
So if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying that there are at least 4 benefits that come when we teach our kids the dark parts of the church's history. The first is that it teaches our kids authenticity and truthfulness, saying, hey, you can trust me that I will be authentic with you in telling you things about the church's history that are not easy to hear.
Yeah.
The second benefit is that it teaches kids that as messed up as they are, as messed up as we all are, the prophets were just as messed up. And that gives us hope, knowing that people who have done amazing things have also done some really terrible things. And that gives hope for us, knowing that we can do amazing things too. The third thing is realizing that they need Jesus Christ just as much as we do. And if they had to depend on the Savior, that just gives us hope, realizing that we can depend on the Savior as well. We can't go too far. There's no place that the atonement doesn't reach.
Yeah.
And then the fourth thing is it helps us to listen to our kids, and it helps us to be vulnerable enough with them where they can teach us things, and where we can be authentic and genuine in saying, thank you for bringing those concerns to me. Let's talk about this in a way where I'm not trying to shame you for what you're saying.
Yeah. My friend called his dad. He said, "Dad, I just found something online and I'm really, son, how's your testimony?"
Mm.
Click. I mean, my friend literally hung up on him. He just wanted to hear, like, we have to practice tactical empathy and be able to be willing to listen and go, this is a genuine problem this kid is dealing with, and it might not be my problem. Because what I hear when I would talk to leaders, most often it would be like, well, that's not something I've ever dealt with. Well, I am. Yeah, you know what I mean? And this kid might be. And frankly, a lot of the conversations I've continued to have with leadership is like in a hope that the next person that comes through their office will have a little bit better reception than I did.
Yeah. Try to help me with this question that I have. A lot of people have had really traumatic experiences with the church. A lot of people have learned things, have found out things about the church's history where it feels like a rug is being pulled out from under them, or it feels like they're metaphorically being thrown off a cliff.
Yeah.
When people go through these things, when they have these traumatic experiences, is it okay to justify their traumatic experiences at the expense of someone else?
Yeah, I appreciate that. There is a beautiful passage in the Talmud that says, never judge a man for what he says in his grief. When I was going through a faith crisis, I was an Elder Quorum president. I lost my faith entirely, and I felt like a rabid dog. I was lashing out at anything that would come anywhere near me. I mean, because I felt like I had died. I mean, that's how big of a loss I'd felt. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle to understand. I tell people, your child who is leaving the church and struggling and coming out and like just pestering you, like, why are you still believing this? Why you do this? Whatever. And it's a projection of the pain they're going through. I'll tell you the antidote. I was going to my mom, and I'm just like I gave up talking to my dad because he wasn't engaging at all. But I needed to know from my inner child, is my family still going to accept me? And I'm going to bark and bark and bark and bark and bark until somebody just acknowledges that my pain is real. All I wanted to hear from priesthood leaders or whatever is just like, I can see why you might be struggling with this. But what I got was, that's not my problem. Or you probably read something wrong, and it makes you feel crazy. It makes you feel like, no, I know, like, and it's okay that it's like just bringing a plate of food and somebody's like, I really like steak. And somebody's like, well, I don't, and you're going, but it's okay that you don't like it and I like it. But the steak is, like, it doesn't, my point is like, somebody can be struggling with something and the other person doesn't have to, and my mom, I went to her and I just finally one day, this is interesting. Okay. She, in her patriarchal blessing, read this to me, and I'm like, you've got to send that to me. It says, you will be an instrument to help people who have issues with the historical something in the church. I was like, what? For some reason that calmed her down, right? And I was like, dude, you got to send that to me. And I read it. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's not lying. This says that, right? She had been so afraid because she's like, what does this mean that my son's like struggling with his faith? And what does that mean for my kids and my grandkids and all that stuff? That's a normal thing to wonder, right? But what you hope when you're struggling with this is that you're going to find some stability. You're going to find a spiritual leader who's going, nothing you say is going to ruffle me. Like, keep talking. My mom finally one day, she said to me after I just ranted. I was ranting. I did a lot. That's probably why I scared my bishop. She said, tell me more. Think of the strength it takes to say those 3 words. I think those 3 words are more powerful than I love you right now. Tell me more. I want to hear what you're going through. I think that was kind of the last time I felt a need. It was like the wind went out of my sails. If we learn to have that spiritual capacity, I think my best friend, he's like, if the bishop would have said that to me, I don't think I would have ever left the church. Wow. How many people have said that kind of words to me? Because you're going through a trauma already. Now, the second trauma happens when you're trying to tell somebody that you love about it.
Yeah.
It's like a re-traumatization. You're going, I don't know how to say this to my parents or anybody. And so it comes out as a barf, usually. So there's ways of dealing with this that are better. But when you're in pain, you don't know what you're doing. So I try to tell people who are struggling with their kids or their spouse or somebody, just because they say something doesn't mean they mean it. We got to look to the inner child here. Neil Maxwell said, you got to blow the chaff away to get to the inner kernel. That's a beautiful concept, because the truth is we're talking to a human being who's in pain, who's grieving right now of the loss of what they thought was, whether you believe what they believe or not, it doesn't matter. In fact, I would recommend a book called Never Split the Difference. It's Chris Voss. He's an FBI hostage negotiator, and he teaches the concept of tactical empathy. He's like, listen, because the false idea is that somebody, if they're going to listen and validate somebody, they're going to give up ground. And as a hostage negotiator, he doesn't want to give the terrorist anything, but he wants to get that back, right?
Right.
You're in a hostage negotiation crisis when you're dealing with faith crisis. You're in a communication where somebody's not rational. That's important to understand. Both sides are usually not rational. Because, we had family members call us up, tell us, don't talk to our kids. I'm like, you realize I'm still going to church, right? All I wanted to hear was, how are you doing? I'm going through the worst, hardest trial of my life. I just want somebody to say, are you okay? I wasn't. I was not okay. I went through, some severe depression,
There's a lot of people get really upset when you bring up the word context. For me, I believe that bringing up context in a situation does not justify any inappropriate behavior that someone has done. For example, Brigham Young. Realizing the context that racism was rampant, not only in the church, but in the U.S. and also in the church back in Brigham Young's day, it does not justify the racism that was in the church. Yeah. It does not defend Brigham's racism, giving the context of that. It does help you to better understand his intentions. Yes. Similarly, I feel like giving the context of saying when somebody is going through a faith crisis, they are going through the hardest thing of their whole life. That doesn't justify the crazy behavior that they may have where they're barking at everyone and trying to tear everyone down. But it does help you to understand their intentions and saying, I'm not crazy for going through this, and everybody thinks that I'm crazy. So I think that it's important to realize that although those behaviors are not justified, the context does help you to better understand what they're going through.
Yeah, I think that's good. And in fact, I would say, as a point of reference for people who are going through their faith crisis, I had a kid come to my home one day, and this kid was leaving the church. I think he got his records removed, and he's like, "Can I talk to you about religion?" And I know that he had kind of gone around to some of the neighborhood kids, like telling them about stuff, like to try to tell them, this is a bunch of crap and all this stuff, And I said to him, this is the craziest timing. I had just cut down a tree in my yard that was like a 40-year-old pine tree. And I said to him, hey, how long do you think it took me to cut down that tree? And he's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, my chainsaw broke, so I had to chop it down. So it took me about an hour. I was like, how long do you think it took to grow? And he said, I don't know. I said, I counted the rings. It was about 40 years.
Wow.
I said, do you want to be in the business of planting trees and growing forests or cutting them down? And he's like, I think I understand what you're saying. And he talked to me about a year later. And he's like, I really took that to heart, and I quit talking to people, projecting my pain onto other people, right? And I think that's what we're talking about here. Like, I think for somebody who is going through a faith crisis, I hope that that's the goal in mind at some point, to like rein your pain in and kind of process through it. So you have to, like, but at some point you have to get to a point where you go, what business do I want to be in? I mean, you think of the sequoias, like people were cutting down entire trees to make pencils, right? And it takes a lot of, like, it's easy to just point out a paragraph and say, look at this terrible thing this person did. I'm going to chop down the life of a human being that spent their whole entire life. Like somebody sent me a list of things that said, all the reasons you just hate every president of the United States. Wow. And it had a paragraph below every single one of them. I'm going, dude, well, I have read like volumes on Thomas Jefferson. And that to me has more to do with growing trees, right? And seeing that perspective. That's a chopping tree mentality. Yeah. So I would love to see us move into a better space on both camps, right? Yeah. Into where we're going, no, people don't just leave the church because they're lazy, because we do the same chopping on the other side, or because they've sinned or whatever. No, there's legitimate reasons. Right. And we have to acknowledge it on both sides. Yeah.
And I think that, I hope that people don't misunderstand what we're trying to say, because I think that when going through a traumatic experience, you have to go through the grieving process. You have to. But I also think that it is not appropriate to turn grief into unnecessary suffering. Mm-hmm. I think that it is okay to cry. It is okay to scream at the world, to say why, to process those emotions in a healthy way. Yeah. But it is not okay to turn that grief into something that it doesn't deserve to be turned into.
Yeah. Well, what happens is, like, we move into this place of, from a biblical analogy, you're in the Garden of Eden, and you're like in this state of naivety and like simplicity, and all of a sudden you're thrust into complexity, into the wilderness. And you go, I don't know what to do, and you're lashing out and you're doing all this stuff. The goal is not to stay in the wilderness. The goal is to move out and to go into a place that the Buddhists call like the happy fool, or like a nirvana, or something, into a place where you kind of like come back around to a place of mature naivety to a certain degree. And there's so many biblical references to this. That's the whole purpose. That's part of what I hope when I talk with people is to say, oh, look, you're in the wilderness right now. You're stuck. Like, you're lashing out. Yeah. Like, let's move into a better space. And what we have a lot of times is people, I'll share it. I don't know if you saw the movie Lincoln, but Abraham Lincoln was trying to get people, he was trying to eradicate slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, but he's kind of doing it through the backdoor measures, right? And there was a senator who also wanted the abolition of slavery, but he accused Lincoln of having no moral compass. And Lincoln says to him, he says, listen, he says, the funny thing about a compass is it'll point you north, but it doesn't tell you about all the bushes and the hills and the valleys and all the swamps in between, right? So what I hope we do with leadership and parenting and all this stuff is we understand that kids are in the middle of a wilderness that they don't know how to navigate, because we're still sometimes wanting to stay in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. And we haven't gone and done the work maybe sometimes to help them through these real significant obstacles. And as a result, they're just, and adults too, they've never seen a model of how to actually go north sometimes. And so part of leadership as parenting is us going like, look, I actually sometimes have to go into the wilderness to find my kid. And I've got to say, listen, you're stuck in a bush right now. Like, you're beating your head against a wall or a tree or something. Like, I've been here. I know what this is like. Let's move around. Like, so we're trying what's happening right now with a lot of people leaving the church is, what we hope is to move people out of that complexity into something bigger, into something. And this is something I had to learn the hard way, quite frankly. And I learned it because I was looking. I just had a realization. I read this thing. It was called The Levels of Energy, and it had like gratitude and love and all this stuff on the top of the list, and it had like anger and blame and victimhood and all this stuff down on the bottom of this levels of energy. I'm like, dude, I am down here all the time. I had to come to a realization, like, I'm stuck. And I really want to be in love and gratitude. I want to be there, but I couldn't even see how to get there. And but just knowing that that's where I wanted to go was kind of a big step for me. And realizing I'm actually going to have to swallow some pride to get there was a really tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
It was hard.
Yeah.
And I'm not recommending this to anybody. I had to go back to my roots. I actually started listening to general conference talks because I'm going, I have to find out what it is I'm so triggered about. It's a journey that it was only specific to me. I'm not saying everybody has to do this. I was studying Buddhism, and Buddhism is all about oneness. All this stuff. I'm like, how can I be one with people if I'm leaving an entire group? And just like, it doesn't mean I have to participate, but it doesn't mean I have to just lash out and be angry all the time at them. I have to find a way to forgive this, right?
Yeah.
That's a deeper spiritual work that I hope on both sides we have to move into.
Yeah.
And say, again, pride is the enemy. It just is.
And I think that that's not to say that it's easy. I think going
mean,
through that was probably excruciating.
Hardest thing I've ever done. Yeah. And I can honestly say, though, I have I really genuinely feel gratitude for my heritage. And that's something I would have thrown up at 5, 6 years ago. I would have just vomited saying that out of my mouth.
I think that's so powerful. And I think that people on both sides should try to emulate that a little bit more, in realizing that pride is the common enemy. And the only way to overcome that is with love and understanding and empathy. Going back to what we were saying earlier, what do you think is the best way to react when a loved one leaves the church?
The first thing is like understanding, like, it's hard because you have to be able to check your emotions and take a deep breath and be there for somebody and say, are you okay? Like, that's the biggest piece. Like, validation.
And that's not to say, like, are you okay? AKA, like, is there something,
no.
like, there's something wrong with you, right? It's saying, like, are you genuinely, like, I care about you. I love you. Are you okay? Is everything okay?
Yeah. I mean, I can't even imagine how powerful that would have been, right? So this is a thought that came to me recently that made me feel so good inside. I thought, you know what would have, like, I actually struggled more with my faith because of the way I got responded to. I think if I would have had a better response, it would have been different. And because then you get a snowball going, and you're going, I don't know what to do. I don't even know where I'm going. Like, I would love for this to happen. This is a pipe dream. You know how we have these missionary plaques that we give to missionaries? What if, when somebody leaves the church, we hand them a plaque that says, thank you for the time that you gave us. Thank you for the mission that you served. Thank you for the financial donations you gave. Thank you for taking a week off of your family vacation to spend time with my snot-nosed kid. We love you. We would love to have you back if you ever decide to do so.
If there are any bishops or stake presidents watching this man, these words, that is so powerful.
I'm like, I can't even, why would I leave that? Why would I leave that? I wouldn't. I'd be like, oh, well, I didn't expect that. I think I'm gonna stay put. But right now we're just kind of give people a boot out the door,
Yeah.
I mean, when I can't just try to imagine, like, I genuinely thought I was trying to do something good for my neighborhood and everything, and trying to do the best I could. I wasn't doing, like, in my own way. I was like what Elder Holland said, just start with what you know, right? I'm going, well, all I know how to do is, like, have parties. So I'm trying to get members and non-members together in my neighborhood, and we're going camping together. I'm trying to unite my neighborhood. In the middle of that is when I got my temple recommend taken away. It felt like you know, I have given a lot to this church. It felt so. I curled in a ball and cried for days. I mean, my wife and I went up into the mountains for a week and just stared, and we didn't like. I don't even know what to do because we felt so worthy, you know. So, if we were to do no agenda, thank you. That just completely validates somebody's intentions, right? Just like, you know what? I had a great time here. And I know that if I come back, I'm going to get it received well or whatever, you know? I don't have to beat a dead horse. I think you get the point.
What are some other things that are good to say for those who have left the church? You said one good thing is to say, are you okay? To genuinely ask them how they are. Another thing is to say thank you for the service that you've given the church. What are some other things that are good to say to those who have left the church?
I think it's okay for somebody to set boundaries and say, you know, I'm not willing to talk to you about that. I think that's okay to say. Well, what I mean is, like, if somebody's like constantly coming at somebody, I think it's okay for somebody who stays in the church to go, listen, I need to set up boundaries. I love you. I want to hear everything you have to say. I can see that you're in pain. You know, I don't believe the same as you, and that's okay. I love you no matter what. And, you know, I mean, that's one thing you could say. I think it's okay. If they're asking for boundaries, say, I don't want you to ever talk around the church around me, then you should also have the right to be able to have your own boundaries. I think there's nothing really you can say. You're not going to be able to. I can tell you some things not to do. Don't send somebody a talk a talk that's like doubt your doubts.
Yeah.
Don't send. There's this talk that a Quorum of the 70 guy gave up in BYU, Idaho, that was like the only 4 questions you should ask. I'm like, well, those are not my questions. I got sent that probably half a dozen times, right? Good intentions. It doesn't help. So you're trying to fix a problem, and you haven't even asked me a question. You don't even know what my problem is. Okay, there we go. We're onto something. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions that they're leaving because of this, this, and this.
That they're uneducated, that they're misinformed, that they just want to go off and sin.
My wife she fumes because she thinks, her whole family thinks that it's my fault that she left the church. My bishop told me, he's like, do you think if you wouldn't have said anything, you know, to your wife, she would have never left the church? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, she's like, I have my own thoughts. I have my own feelings. I'm my own person. I made my own decisions, you know. Don't ever make assumptions about what people are thinking or feeling, because, and going back to Chris Voss and the hostage negotiator, he's like, he has no idea what terrorists are thinking. The only thing he can do is listen to them and just let them keep talking. And you can mirror and just say, so if I'm hearing right, it sounds like, so that they know you're listening. Like, so is it because, you know, and being genuinely honest, you know?
So things like, tell me more.
Tell me more.
Things like, I see your journey, or tell me about your journey.
Yep. I had, and if you're ready and in a space to be able to listen to it, maybe you're not. And you could even be honest and say, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if I can handle that right now. That's okay. But I love you, and I'm trying to get to a space where I can hear that. Yeah. Right? I had a guy who I went to as a guy who was a stake president, and I got done. I was spewing about polygamy for 2 hours. Oh, you know, and he got done, and he shook my hand. He was an old stake president, and he held my hand. He looked at me, and he said, "You have taught me so much today." And I was like, "No, I haven't." I knew I had, but he was totally genuine. I was like, I just want to hug this man right now, right? Over time, as we listen and we have empathy and sympathy, even, like, people start to kind of figure things out on their own. Trust people. My bishop once asked me, what can I do to help you? I said, just trust me. Trust me that I'm trying to figure this out, that I'm trying to do the best thing right now, but I'm broken. There's nothing you can do about it. Just trust me. One thing you can do is not take away my temple recommend. But anyway, because that doesn't help, right?
I think that's so powerful. I think that a lot of times we think that as members of the church, we have to stand up for our beliefs, and that means arguing over the internet. And I think that what we don't understand is when there is arguments that come out of a place of disrespect, nothing good happens from that. There is no problem solving. You have to come from a place of empathy and understanding on both sides. I feel like for members and for those who have left the church, you have to say, hey, I don't agree with you, but I understand where you're coming from. I would just love to see if two people were walking down the street and they ran into each other and they said, I don't agree with you. Oh, well, I don't agree with you, but I respect you. And I respect you. I think so much positivity and change and goodness could happen from that. Talking about becoming one, obviously nobody in the world has the same beliefs as you. This is something that I've realized ever since starting my Faith and Focus social media channels, is that even those who have left the church are not united in all their beliefs.
At all.
And even those who are still in the church are not united in their beliefs.
There's going to be people on here that hate my guts.
I'm
sure about it.
And so I think that that's just such an important thing, is to say, I respect your journey. I respect your beliefs. There's a story that I came across online once that it changed my whole life. And in this story, there were two women's soccer teams that were playing a soccer match. And one of the players, her hijab started to fall off. And the players on the opposite team, they huddled around her and they shielded her in privacy so that she can fix it in privacy. And that blew me away, because these players on the other team, they probably didn't share her same religious beliefs, but they had so much respect for her and for her beliefs that they were willing to make a shield around her so that she could fix it in privacy. And I just think, what could the world come to if everybody had that mentality and approached people saying, I don't agree with you, but that doesn't mean that I'm against you. That doesn't mean that I'm attacking you. I am on your team because I love you. And even though I don't agree with you, that doesn't mean that I can't respect you and respect your beliefs and respect your opinions, even if they may be different than mine.
That's beautiful. And it's interestingly, I actually wrote this down. I would love for people to listen to on YouTube. There's a thing, Wilford Woodruff got recorded on a talking machine, he calls it, in 1896. And he says, this is Wilford Woodruff. In 1896, I declared that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God. And he goes on to this thing and he says, I was there. The one thing he chooses to say into this machine is, he says, I heard Joseph Smith say that if he were emperor of the world, he would make sure that everybody had the right to practice their religion in the way they wanted to practice it. Like, it's a tenet of, it's like, we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience. And we have to afford that same thing to people who leave the church and give them the free will and the trust to be able to do that. And ironically, when we give that trust, they give us so much more back. So in a lot of ways, people are reacting. They're just reacting to the way we are treating them to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's human nature that when you are coming at someone, guns blazing, obviously the reaction is that they're going to dig their heels in further. They're going to build up defensive walls around them, and they're just going to start slinging mud back at you. But when you lower your walls, when you come at them from a place of empathy and understanding, and even saying, hey, I understand where you're coming from, and even maybe saying, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably feel the same way that you do. When that happens, the defensive walls are lowered, people stop digging in their heels, and then they can then approach the other person saying, oh, you understand me? Oh,
that's beautiful.
Now maybe I can start to understand you a little bit better too.
Yeah. In fact, we had to sit down, my in-laws, my father-in-law is a patriarch. I look up to him. He's been one of my greatest mentors of my entire life, and they're very devout. And they had to watch almost all of their kids fall away from the church, and it scared them. And I realized at a point, my wife and I were like, we need to sit them down. And we sat them down, and we said, it feels like you guys are maybe a little afraid of what's going on, and they don't, like, I could tell that they thought we were ganging up on them too a little bit. It wasn't the case, but they understandably felt that way. We just want you guys to know that we love where you're at. We wouldn't want to change that at all. I love that you're a patriarch. We love the joy you get from it. We love that you want to share that with our kids. Please share it anytime you want. That's part of being a grandparent, sharing the things you love. All of the energy, just that talk changed everything. In fact, you and I hadn't talked to my dad. My dad's been just very standoffish and defensive about this. When you and I were in Boston going to Ireland, I just had this moment, like I think I need to text my dad in case I die on this plane or something. I don't know why. I just had it, and I texted him this big long thing saying, "Dad, I love that you love family history. I wouldn't change a thing about the way you raised me. I can't. I just all these. I wouldn't want you to. Even if I could, I wouldn't want to change your beliefs at all." And it's the first time that I know of that he's responded back and said, "I love you." He's a very unemotional human being. He doesn't really respond to text. I got a novel back. I could feel the relief from him. It's a two-way street, you know? And so those things changed the relationship, but it not just changed the relationship with my parents and my in-laws. It made me feel better. I don't feel like I need to have this battle, you know? I'm asking them to accept where I'm at, but I'm not willing to do it for them. Like, I don't think we sometimes see that this is a two-way street, you know? And since that time, since I've been kind of practicing this, all these memories start flooding in to all the beautiful things that these people in this community have given to me and the time they've spent with me. Anybody, even if they've made mistakes, anybody who has wanted any good for me throughout my childhood, I didn't pay a dime for my daughter's mission. Everybody pitched in from my community and said, we're gonna take care of it. I kept going in and saying, can we pay that? No. Not a dime. I have to acknowledge that. It's an amazing people.
Yeah.
Anyway.
What would you say to someone who has left the church, who has had these traumatic experiences, who have gone through these excruciating things? Mm-hmm. What would you say to someone who says, I can't respect the church, or I can't respect the members? I have had such a terrible experience. I cannot respect. What would you say to them?
I would say that's a legitimate. Like, I would say, hell, I'm sorry. Like, I know that there's real reasons for that. Because there have been instances of abuse and different things where they just like, I can't get over it, right? I would also say that there is a reality that we as humans do, where we take a story and we build on it, and we build and we build and we amplify it to the nth degree, right? I think it's really important for anybody in or outside of the church to really dig deep in the stories we tell ourselves. And I'm not trying to say that somebody hasn't had any trauma and they shouldn't feel that way. But in many cases, I should probably just speak for myself and say I 100% added to my story. And I 100% was like, yeah, I'm in pain. I've been rejected, yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to go down the rabbit hole, and I'm going to literally, it becomes an addiction sometimes to just feed that part of your story. Yep, that's why I'm right. That's why I'm leaving the church. That's why I'm doing this, because I'm listening to this story and this story and this story, you know. And it takes a tremendous amount. Like, if you're feeling in that space, my plea would be to set a sight on something to move into a better, higher level of energy. And that may require a therapist. I had to have therapy. I mean, but you don't want to stay there. Like, hate is not an energy you want to dwell in forever, right? And I think I got a little bit of mine happened through just a saving grace. My grandmother died right in the middle when I was in the middle of like hating the church so bad. And she was like the best thing I'd ever known. And the church was so meaningful to her. And I was with a group and they were making fun of the temple ceremony or something. And I just wanted to curl in a ball. And I was like, you know, this meant so much to my grandma. And it was really just all of a sudden I started to feel like this intensity and started to do some inner work and go, I need to move out of this space. And I literally saw this little pinhole at the end of a tunnel that was a little bit of light that that represented gratitude for me, because they say, you know, there's the second half of life for a lot of people. There's this, Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, talks about the second half of life is this thing you're moving. This should be a little bit more enlightened and more personal. You're kind of like, you're not, you have your own thoughts, not just the thoughts of your parents and leaders all the time. You're moving to more personal spirituality. And I genuinely thought I was like enlightened. I was like, I know more and I know better. I know all these things about church history and all this stuff. And I was feeling like I knew all this stuff. And I heard this thing when they said, you'll know when you're moving into the second half of life when you can feel gratitude for the first half of life. And I genuinely just dropped, I just went, oh my gosh, like I'm not anywhere near feeling gratitude for the first half of life. What kind of enlightenment is that, right? So I set my sights on like, I have to find gratitude. In fact, it made me want to throw up. I mean, I was like, I actually don't see any other option. The only option towards peace is finding gratitude. There's no other option. I don't see any other option, because otherwise you're always going to be like in a state of blame and in a lower level of thinking and energy and that sort of thing. And that's just not where I wanted to stay. But I could see that I had to move through all these emotions to get to there.
Yeah.
It wasn't over. It took me 3-4 years from when I kind of set my sights on that. That does not mean you have to agree with the church. That doesn't mean you have to go back to church or anything other than you can acknowledge the intention of the good that people had for you.
So as a little bit of a devil's advocate, what if I were to say, I am on a quest for truth, not peace?
Yeah.
Because truth, brings me peace, right? What if I were to say, I can't be satisfied until I have the peer-reviewed evidence that proves that the Book of Mormon is true. And I'm going to obsess over this quest for truth instead of going on this quest for peace or feelings or beliefs like the church would teach you to do. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, I was on a similar quest, and I kind of had this moment where I was like, I don't know why I'm so weird or something, but I don't feel like I'm getting that wasn't my question. My question was, is this true or not? Like, I don't listen to music and go, is this song true? But it makes me feel something, right? So this is going to trigger a lot of people who have left the church. I still read the Book of Mormon, and I don't even care whether it's true or not. In fact, I think so many people are putting it on a pedestal, we got the trophy, but they don't even really know what's inside of it. I'm really curious to know what's inside of it. Like this thing that Uchtdorf says, I'm like, there's something fascinating about this friction between these two people and how they're resolving and not resolving it. That's really interesting. When I read the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Hindu scriptures, like 3, 4, 5,000 years, I don't even know. I never asked. I'm like, I'm just reading it. It never even dawned on me to ask whether it was true or not. Is it helping me? Is it useful? And that's what I teach my kids about all scripture. Try to listen to it. Like, whether it's true or not is somebody else's question. That might be your question, right? There are a million different questions you can ask about scripture. Like, I think of it like apples. Like there's like 7,000 varieties of apples. And you go to the store, there's like 4 or 5 of them. There's a gala, there's those mushy red ones, I want to try a lot of different apples, right? So I would say that at the heart of every major religion is a quest for liberation. And Mormonism is no different. And I didn't realize that till I studied Hinduism. And I was sitting there, and the objective of Hinduism is what they call moksha. It literally means liberation. The obstacle to liberation is what they call maya. It means illusion. And I was sitting in there studying from a Hindu priest one day, and I was like, I'm so envious of that. I wish we had something like that, because it's kind of taps into the subconscious and all this stuff, the illusions we tell ourselves that aren't true, right? That don't bring us peace. So I don't know if there's truth and peace, or they're probably the same thing to me. I thought, I wish we had something like that in my own faith tradition. And then I was like, it just hit me one day. I'm like, we do. The whole entire First Nephi 8 through 11 is a group of people walking through a mist of darkness. The whole world is in a mist of darkness. It's an illusion. They can't find the way. They don't know where they are. The end goal is you get to the tree of life, which represents the pure love of God. And it's the equivalent of moksha. The Buddhists call it nirvana. Nirvana is like you've reached enlightenment. You're like, and I'm going, if you feel the pure love of God, then you're able to see the truth about every human being, period. That's the goal for me. So it has more to do about orthopraxy than orthodoxy, meaning orthopraxy means the way you behave, the way you practice your religion. Orthodoxy is like, this is right and this is wrong.
It's the theology.
It's like, you have to baptize somebody this way. You have to do things this way. I'm not going to discount that. I can't wrap my head around that. But I can wrap my hand around grace. And when somebody offers me grace, and I'm like, I can feel that. I'm an artist. I feel things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because we are emotional beings. As much as we sometimes hate to admit it, we are emotional beings. And although we have a logical side of the brain, we also have an emotional side of the brain. Mm-hmm. And neither one is more important than each other. I feel like they both have to work together. I feel like they're both equally as important. And I think sometimes in our quest for truth, we dismiss our emotional side of the brain and we just try to focus on the logical, when in reality, the emotional side of the brain is so important because, like you were saying, it helps us to find peace, which could be truth,
And the truth shall set you free. I don't know how to separate those two.
We know that we cannot force or manipulate anybody who has left the church to come back.
Yeah.
If there is anything that we could do that could help with their journey of if they ever choose to decide to come back, what are some do's and do nots when it comes to this? I know that there's a podcast that I've listened to. It's called the Comeback Podcast. And the whole podcast is about members of the church who have left. They've gone through their faith crisis and then they eventually decide to come back.
Yeah.
And there are some interesting things that I've seen through these stories is that the people who end up coming back, there are certain things that the people around them consistently have done or consistently haven't done. What would you say are some things that we should do or shouldn't do with any hope that those who have left the church could come back?
Yeah. I think it starts early. I'm going to go back because for some people, it's like my wife, who she just like felt so like she didn't have any choice. And she had a great upbringing. I'm envious of her upbringing, frankly. She was presented one option, and that one option ultimately led her going, I need to experience something else. I have to have this ability to know, to choose for myself. Free will is the greatest gift that God ever gave us. But we practice a type of free will that's called the double bind. And that says you can choose, you can choose, but as long as you voluntarily choose what we want you to choose, right? I think we actually, using a sand metaphor, if you hold sand in your hand like this, and you cup it, it'll just stay there. But as soon as you start to squeeze it, it all starts to fall out. I love the idea of Rumspringa and the Amish. When they're like 19, they're like, go out, go ahead, go out, get out of here. I don't know what the stats are now, but they were like 90% of the people returned because they were given free will to just go.
Yeah.
And one of the things as a culture that I think would be so healthy for us to do is allow people to leave with their dignity intact. And that's why I like the plaque idea. And say, dude, we love the time we've had here and that sort of thing. When we give people the dignity and don't make it so hard for them to leave, it's easier to come back. And so I think right now, especially in our time, day and age, where authenticity and there's so many things to explore, I would love to see us embrace some of the early Mormonism ideas where Joseph Smith was saying, we hold every truth in every religion. It doesn't matter where you find truth. Go and find it and bring it back to our community. And that was a very abundant mentality in terms of like, just go ahead. We trust you'll come back because we're going to take truth from anywhere, right? Right now, in an information age, I think that would be revolutionary. And I think we would that would be a big thing that could happen. Because unless that piece changes, it's really hard to convince somebody to come back and say, we need you to change. For us, for our, as your parents, we need you to come back because it makes us feel icky. Do you know what I mean? Instead, radical acceptance of just saying, you know what, we'd love to have you back, but we can see that, we can see that you're doing great things. Yeah. And it's really been so nice to hear my in-laws say, you guys are such good parents. Like, we just love what you're doing with our grandkids. Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff makes me want to be a part of this community. And frankly, that's why I still engage in the community, because I genuinely love these people. Yeah. And I didn't for a little while. I genuinely struggled there, but I'm going, I love how these people are just, that my kids can roam around this neighborhood and it's like a little village. Yeah. And they want the best for my kids. So those kind of things I think go a long way of, I'd love to see a shift there. And I think it's happening to where we just we let people graduate if they feel like graduating. Mm-hmm. And then doors always open. Yep.
I have 2 siblings who have left the church. Both of my sisters have left the church. And with my younger sister, she still lives in Utah. My older sister lives in Texas. But my younger sister, we get together. We have family dinners every month or so. And with every family dinner, we have, an opening prayer. We bless the food. Mm-hmm. And my dad, he's just the greatest guy. He noticed that it might be a little bit uncomfortable for my sister and her husband who have left the church to do this opening prayer and, to say worship with us or whatever. And so my dad went up to my little sister one day and he said, hey, we want you to feel included. We want you to feel like we're doing our thing over here and you kind of have to just participate. And so he asked her, he said, at our next family dinner, instead of us giving the prayer, I want to turn the time over to you. Mm-hmm. And if you could share with us something that you have been learning in your spiritual journey, we would love to hear from you in any goodness that you can bring to our family. She loved that. And so what we did for that next family dinner is she's kind of embracing a lot of Buddhism and those kind of philosophies, which I think is great. And so what we did is at our next family dinner before eating, instead of saying an opening prayer, she said, okay, let's pile up our plates with food and let's take that plate of food and let's just look at it and take a moment before we eat and just take a moment of silence just to think about the food and where it came from. Think about the farmers, think about the factory workers, think about the truck drivers who delivered the food, think about all the stages that the food went through to get to our tables and how grateful we are for all of the people who were involved in that process, the animals who gave up their life, and to just think about that for a couple seconds and to just be grateful. And we did. And it was amazing. Awesome. I loved that. It was so awesome.
That's great. I love that. And those things go a long way. And I think it's important. I don't think we think of this numbers wise, but honestly, the people who don't come to church are the silent majority in the church. And I think it's one of the most under-tapped pieces of human resources on the planet. Like if we made some shifts and made a little bit of room, like there's a lot of things my wife would be totally willing to go do, and et cetera, We're not embracing maybe some of those early tenets of Mormonism. It's like, dude, truth is truth. John Taylor said, I don't care if Satan's got truth. I want it. That's a bold statement.
Very bold, yeah.
But this is the kind of rhetoric they were talking about. Just like, we want truth. And there's, I heard a historian, he told me, he's like, Joseph Smith heard about something somebody was doing 2 states over, got in a carriage, and he heard that this guy was doing some kind of like cranial work or something. And he just was so curious, he got in a carriage and drove for 2 days to find out what this guy was doing. Wow. There was an insatiable desire for learning and And I also think I think we're missing a huge opportunity with our neighbors who are Lutherans and Presbyterians and all these different things. We all believe in Jesus, you know? And in some ways, I think we're going to get to the next life and God's going to go, I kind of, your neighbor had he had one of the answers I wanted you to understand about me. Because he was Baptist and they're really good at grace, you know? Well, why didn't you go talk to that guy? You could have gone and asked him a question, you know? Because really there's this old saying that says the most interesting person in the room is the most interested. I would love to see missionary work shift to like, let's be interested in people and see what happens. We have nothing to lose.
Wow.
I don't know. It's a thought.
That's a great thought. Yeah. Any mission presidents who are watching.
My wife and I when we were like going, we're leaving the church. This was in 2016. We literally like, I think we're going to leave the church. But you know what? I see the value in Sundays and like having a ritual and having a belief system and like having something that we do. I don't want to just go make this play day. We did a little bit of that too. We went to over 50 churches.
Wow.
With our kids, and my daughter still served a mission. I'm like, you guys, can you see how similar these people are to us? And can you see how they have the same flaws and they make the same mistakes? And you think you're going to go find the grass is greener on the other side? Humans are humans, no matter where you go. We went to mosques. We went and danced with Hindus. We went to a Native American church. We went to Lutheran. One of the greatest things, I was sitting in a Lutheran church with my family, and my back door neighbor was like 80 years old. I like Melanie. Al is right in front of us in the pew, and his wife was Mormon, and she was always like, "I know my husband's not Mormon. I'm sorry," kind of thing, you know. Yeah. He turns around when we were done, and he just like gave us the biggest hug. We'd been neighbors for 7 years. He's like, "I can't believe you're here. What are you doing here?" I'm like, "We're just trying to get our kids to understand, like, there's good people everywhere," and the yada yada. He's like, "Thank you for coming here. That means a lot to me." We went to church with our Presbyterian neighbors, and we got to the parking lot, got out of the car, I turn around, and I see her running like a blur. She's not used to having her Mormon neighbors show interest in her belief system. She ran to me and just embraced my whole family. It still brings me to tears of just feeling like these people care about, they're interested in me. You know, I think those are the kind of things, if we show that same kind of interest in our loved ones that are sitting right in front of us, which takes a lot of work because there's so much history and there's so much love and fear and all that stuff with our loved ones. My mom is my wife's biggest fan on Instagram. And my wife, she meets with clients every day with healing trauma and all this stuff. And my wife's like, "Your mom just praises me every time I make a post." And it means the world to her. That there's something outside of church that she values her for. That's a big, big deal, to feel valued, that you not just because of that label, but you have value outside, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway.
This is something that I know that I need to hear personally, because I know so often on social media, I'll be going back and forth with someone who has an opinion that I don't agree with. Mm-hmm. And so often I could just think, man, I could just dunk on them right now. Mm-hmm. I could just mic drop right now. I could just totally destroy them with my philosophy, whatever.
Yeah.
And sometimes I do, and,
Sure.
and I feel bad about this now after having these conversations. But I think going forward, something that I really want to try to be better at is trying to say, hey, I respect your journey. And I can only imagine what you've gone through. Mm-hmm. I can only imagine the trauma that you've faced, the hard experiences that you've had to endure. I can only imagine what it must be like to leave a religion that meant so much to you growing up. I wish that I could hear them and talk to them. Mm-hmm. I wish there was more respect on both sides. I wish that we could just sit down and have a conversation like this, where I could just say, tell me your story. Please be respectful about it, but tell me your story, you know? I think there's so much goodness that could come from that.
It would shock people. I mean, that's the reality. I tell my kids all the time, when you're driving down the road and the kid flips you off or something like that, do the opposite of what they're expecting. That's fun. Yeah. That's far more fun than the natural response you want to do. Train yourself to do what the unexpected. And the unexpected right now in our community is receiving somebody with grace, and the grace and trust that they're there probably for a reason, and they've had to, Yeah. Anyway.
Final question.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite story that I've ever heard when it comes to church stuff is one time there was a sacrament meeting where an 80, 90-year-old man went up. He started to bear his testimony, and he kind of just started rambling. He started talking about the war and his life story and all of these things, when eventually the bishop stood up and he took the man by his shoulder and he whispered into his ear, "What do you think about Jesus Christ?" And the reason why I love this story is because so often in church we talk about good things.
Yeah.
We talk about marriage, we talk about tithing, we talk about all these great things. President Kimball, he once said something along the lines of, "It doesn't matter how much we talk about Jesus, it is never enough." There's no amount that we could talk about that would be enough, that would satisfy enough of how much we could talk about him.
Yeah.
So final question for you, my friend. What do you think about Jesus?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
That's a
What is your
great question.
testimony? How has your relationship with Jesus been the thing that has helped you? What have you learned? How have you grown because of your relationship
I
with
have
him?
so many thoughts here. When I was the Elders Quorum president, in the middle of my faith crisis, I was like, I don't know. I just didn't feel like reading the Doctrine and Covenants or the Book of Mormon or anything like that. But I just dug into the New Testament for 5 years. I want to know the ministry of Jesus, like in Jerusalem. I'm going with what I feel right now. And all of these teachings started to just like open up. In fact, the most profound epiphany that I ever had through this whole thing was when I was reading a scripture, and it said, now remember, Jesus was a Jew. So this was his community. This was his religion. But he's got real friction with his own people. And it says at some point that Jesus, he no longer walked in Jewry. He was afraid for his safety. And I went, oh my gosh, Jesus has been through this. Jesus has had to grapple with his community. And he's had to stand in a public square and defend a woman who had been taken in adultery and put his own reputation on the line. And I think in that moment, he gained the ability to be able to tell this woman, go and sin no more, because he first stood with her in the public square and defended her. And I just started seeing all these things come alive. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I've been reading this wrong a little bit from I've been reading, like, I haven't personalized it, I guess, in some way, And little by little, I started kind of seeing the rebel in Jesus, right? And I'm going, no, Jesus isn't always this nice, fluffy, like, hey, just be nice. No. I mean, Matthew 23, he's tearing the Pharisees to pieces. The people he seems to struggle with the most are the ones who are like, seem to be the most religious, the ones who are like, we've got it figured out, and we know, and all this stuff, And I just started to see like these little parables where he'd say, let your communication be yay, yay, and nay, nay. Change the way I parent my kids. Dad, why did Joe Smith marry a 14-year-old girl or whatever? I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. Like, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I'm not going to go da-da-da-da-da-da and just come to some mental gymnastics. No, I think this, So that kind of plain speaking and what he was saying there, I think he was just saying, let's just be honest with our kids. Just be honest with people. Just tell them how it is. Like, we made mistakes. We didn't, We do great things and we do bad things, All these things I started seeing. But I had a moment where I realized that the big thing that I loved after going to all these different religions and everything, I learned so much, gained so much from Buddhism and Hinduism. But the concept that I think really sets the message of Jesus apart, that changed my life, really was the idea of grace. And I think grace would absolutely, because I tend to like look at Jesus in terms of, I'll be honest, like I don't fully understand the atonement. I don't understand a lot of that. But I really love the idea of the extension of grace and the good news. And I genuinely feel like grace, the example that Christ set for grace in our modern day application as emulating the life of Jesus, would change the world overnight. All of the friction, all of the things that we're blaming people for and doing, and we just offered grace and just said, you know what? I can tell this is going to be a battle to the end of days, like the Nephites and the Lamanites, until we destroy ourselves. One party has to offer grace. It would change everything. If one party has to say, I'm willing to just eat this, right? And I didn't
swallow my pride
and go, this. If we're gonna sit here and try to go, who's right, who's wrong? There's there's a saying of, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy, or would you rather have peace? And if you think of all the conflicts that are going on in the world, and they're all void of grace. You did this. In fact, karma is the idea that you deserve something. You gave something bad, so you get something bad in return. The radical thing that Jesus did was he said, no, you actually return it with good. I'd recommend, if you can read Leo Tolstoy's book, it's called What I Believe. At age 50, he's reading this little scripture that says, resist not evil with evil. And he says, I grew up in a war-torn area. He said, when I really understood that Jesus was literally saying that, everything in my life flipped upside down. Everything. His life changed everything. That book he wrote a book called The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You that was heavily read by Martin Luther King Jr., by Gandhi, who all used that as a mantra to literally change hundreds of millions of people's perspective. So it's the most powerful message. Grace is the most powerful message, I think, that would change everything. And I didn't really know what it meant, to be honest with you, until I lost a bet. This was 2016. I didn't think Donald Trump was going to win the election. And I bet somebody, I said, I will sing in Sacrament a solo if Donald Trump wins the election. And I ended up losing, obviously. And I don't care which way. I didn't really care, but I just didn't think he was going to win. I sang the worst, solo. My family was in the pews laughing their butts off. I totally botched it at the beginning. I had to have the piano guy start over. I had people in the audience going, what is happening right now? It was the most embarrassing. And I put my whole heart and soul into it. And this woman, she came up to me with these big blue eyes. She's 75, 80 years old. And she put both of her hands on my cheeks with her big blue eyes and said, oh dear, you did such a great job up there. And I wanted to just absolutely just hug her, because I knew it was the absolute lie, but she was offering me this grace, and it just kind of gave me this context of this woman is giving me something I didn't deserve at all. That has radically changed my life. The study of Christ's ministry and the study of trying to be like Jesus has been one of the most simple and profound things I've ever done. And it really is. It genuinely, the more I study the parables, the more simple it becomes. And I think that's worth studying over and over and over again. Yeah. And so that's been a real fun journey.
I think that there's a lot of power in saying things like that, saying, hey, you don't have to believe in Jesus, but try to learn about him, learn about his character, learn about his nature, try to become more like him, try to have the grace that he had. And there's a quote, some general authority, he said, probably the thing that God enjoys most about being God is extending mercy to those who don't deserve it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the irony of the whole thing is that so many people who leave the church love Jesus. There's a common ground. So many people are just like, dude, I love that. I love that. I love the ministry of Jesus and what he was trying to do and social change and all this stuff. That is a a really deep common ground that I think we're missing a boat on. And I'll tell you this, I had a family member who we went to lunch with one day. She's like 18 years old, and she was physically shaking. And I'm like, why are you shaking? She's like, because she was living with her parents, and she had left the church without them knowing it, and she was a closet Jesus believer. She was listening to Christian radio and YouTube channels, and she loved Jesus so much, and she was so afraid to tell her parents that she loved Jesus because it wasn't the Jesus that within that context as should be a common ground. Like, yes, great, you figured it out, right? And so, because the Book of Mormon really is like about like pointing to Jesus. It's not like, hey, like the Nephites and the Lamanites, like they ebbed and flowed. It wasn't like, hey, we need you to be a part of this group or part of, no, it's like, just tap into that, right? Because, loyalty would have been a really terrible idea in the Book of Mormon. If that was your thing, I just have to be a Nephite at all costs. It didn't end well for them.
Yep.
Anyway, that's not a side point, but so that's my story. I would say Jesus is the most influential character. I love that Thomas Jefferson. He's like, he considered the Sermon on the Mount to be the most sublime literature that was ever written, and I agree with that.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end it. Thank you again, Casey, for coming on this show.
Thanks for having me.
For sharing your
story. It's always
story.
great to see you.
Yeah, for sharing your thoughts. I truly learned so much, and I hope that you, the viewer who's watching, I hope that you learned just as much. I think that this was amazing. I just am honestly blown away. We need to have more conversations like this.
Yeah.
For those of you who are watching, go ahead and leave your comments below. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, if you hate us,
If you agree, if you disagree, give us a rating. This was an A, B, C, D, whatever.
People always say, where is he at? Is he in or is he out or whatever? I'm like, good. I'm glad you're thinking that.
And to me, to be honest, I could care less, because I see you and I see a man of God who loves Jesus and is more Christ-like than most members of the church that I know. And to me, nothing else matters.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment if you feel so inclined, and we'll see you guys in the next show.
Thank you.